Hey RVF, it's good to see you all. Sorry there was no video last week. I was feeling a bit under the weather and didn't want to bring my germs to my coworkers here, so I stayed away and got healthy. Don't worry, not COVID, all is well. But this week I am feeling much better and ready to jump into John chapter 11. But before we get to the sermon recap, go ahead and take some time to check in with one another, pray for one another, and then read John chapter 11 to refresh your memory. Okay, so the sermon this past week is the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. But before we got into the passage, Kenner gave us a pastoral thought on the idea of fresh perspective or new perspective on our current situation, these strange times that we're living in. He encouraged us that a different perspective on our situation isn't necessarily just going to be answers about why this situation exists or even necessarily what to do about it, but a fresh perspective is most of the time an invitation to trust Jesus and his work in the midst of crisis. I think that's a timely word for us to be able to see our current situation as an invitation from Jesus to continually trust him and his work in the midst of all the uncertainty and things being different. And so that's where we started on Sunday. And then as we got into the passage, before we got to the passage, we recapped that John's whole point in his stated goal is to reveal Jesus as the Son of God. And he does that, he kind of structures his whole book around 7 signs or miracles and then the 7 I am statements of Jesus throughout his writing. And so in this passage, we come to the sign of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and Jesus' statement, I am the resurrection and the life. And so in verses 1 through 16, it recounts the death of Lazarus and how Jesus actually delayed going to him. It says that he waited, and Lazarus had been dead for 4 days by the time he got there. And what we kind of saw in that was that oftentimes delay on God's part is an act of love and an invitation to patience. And then in verses 17 through 27, Jesus declares that he is the resurrection and the life. To know Jesus is to experience freedom and power over death, both in this life and the life to come. And then verses 28 through 44, Jesus is at the tomb with Mary where he experiences and expresses grief over death. And Jesus probably experiences a more unique and deeper grief over death because as fallen humans, we've become accustomed to a fallen world. We've become accustomed to death. It's even a more foreign concept to Jesus. And so he feels the deep sadness and grief over the death of Lazarus. He feels deeply, but then in authority, he calls Lazarus to come out of the grave, and Lazarus awakens from death and walks out of the grave. And then verses 45 through 54, it again shows us that basically every time Jesus does one of these signs or miracles, it creates controversy. And this one is no different. So to the crowd, to those in power at the time, this miracle causes them to fear that their place in society and even their nation could be threatened because of who Jesus is and what he is doing. And we saw that when people's freedom and their place is threatened, they turn to extreme measures to preserve those things. And so they would rather see Jesus be killed unjustly than their positions and their freedoms to be threatened. And so the closing thoughts from this last Sunday were threefold. First of all, we saw that Jesus has entered into humanity's plight and he feels our pain. He is the high priest who is able to sympathize with all of our weaknesses, who has experienced the pain and grief that we experience over death. Secondly, Jesus has brought the redeemed future into the fallen present. When Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, it gives us a taste of the resurrection life that awaits for us when Jesus returns and restores all things. And thirdly, Jesus has offered resurrection and eternal life to all who trust him. So that's kind of a sermon recap for you, a very quick one. Again, make sure you read through the passage to kind of refresh your memory about the content there. But here's a few questions for you to help you reflect a little further. Question number 1, we saw that Jesus delaying to go to Lazarus, it created an opportunity for his disciples and for Mary and Martha to experience his love and also exercise faith. And so here's a few questions about that. How does tragedy produce faith in us? And how is tragedy an invitation to faith and trust in Jesus? And then finally, in what ways have you seen Jesus use tragedy or difficulty in your life as a conduit of his love and faithfulness? So take some time and discuss how tragedy is actually possibly an invitation from Jesus to trust him, to love him, to experience his love in a more meaningful way than we otherwise might experience it. So take some time and discuss that. Question number 2. Jesus came to the tomb and he wept in grief and outrage at the reality of death. So here's the questions. How does seeing Jesus respond to tragedy with real grief and sadness strike you? How might Jesus' response to death help us to understand our own responses to tragedy? And what does it look like for us to mourn and grieve with others who are hurting? So again, take some time to discuss this and really spend some time thinking about what it might communicate to us about the type of God that Jesus is, that he would grieve the way he did over death. And what does that mean for you as you experience tragedy in your life? So take some time and discuss that. And question number 3, Jesus not only embraced the sadness and difficulty of death, but he brought the redeemed future to bear on our fallen present by raising Lazarus to life. So in Jesus, new creation has already begun. So in what ways have you seen the new creation come to bear on our current fallen reality? And how is God inviting us to be agents of new creation in the midst of the brokenness and the tragedy that we live in? So take some time and discuss those things. So as you close your time together this week, spend some time praying and seek perspective that you might see tragedy and hardship as an invitation to trust Jesus and experience his love. Consider how you might be invited as a group and individuals to sit with the hurting and usher in new creation as we wait for Christ to make all things new. So next week we're going to be doing the first half of John chapter 12. You can start studying that, reading that if you'd like to do that. We love you. Hope that you are all doing well. Grace and peace.